Welcome, everyone. Okay, we are going to start by concluding lecture 5. And just like to make the point that even as the war was going on, even as the Holocaust was proceeding, the face of continental Europe was changing very dramatically. Nazi Germany was expanding throughout, and this had a significant impact on the pace of the persecution and killing of Europe's Jews. First, you're seeing this map of Germany and its empire as of 1942, but Europe was constantly evolving. The names of the neutral countries listed here, they remain the same. Some of them are more neutral than others. Here are some countries and regions that had been incorporated into Germany by mid-1940. Austria, which had in essence been appropriated in 1938. Part of Czechoslovakia, the western half of it, which had been appropriated in 1939, etc. So these were considered part of Greater Germany. And then areas that were as of October 1942 occupied by the Germans, part of France, all of the Netherlands, most of Belgium, most of Poland, and as you can see, some annexed. But basically, Germany is expanding. And then we move to areas that were already German aligned as of late 1942, and then progressively they would be occupied. Also, Vichy France came to an end, for example, in November 1942 and became simply part of occupied France, as well as northern Italy, and so on. And then basically what was happening was the Allies were starting to move in. The USSR, the Red Army, was moving west, Britain and the United States and their allies moving east. And the Germans were concerned that some of their allies were either too weak to fend off the invaders, or they really were not that anxious to do so, that they wanted to perhaps make separate peace with them. And we'll see the impact that that would have, particularly in Hungary, in a few minutes. This is essentially what was happening. Germany was expanding even comparatively late in the war, even as late as 1944. And almost invariably, this was bad news to the Jews. The countries that were allies of Germany, even if they were sort of lukewarm allies, being taken over and the Germans giving orders to them to deport their Jews and approving if they murdered Jews. So even in its last phases, the Holocaust was in some respects expanding. The big question was, would the Allies agree to deportation, and how avid would they be in terms of deportation? And certainly one that was very avid was Vichy France. Probably about 40% of the France that had been conquered in 1940. And although the titular leader was Marshal Pétain, a World War I hero, the actual leader of Vichy France during the course of its existence, less than 1.5 years, was this man, Premier Pierre Laval, who himself was strongly anti-Semitic, passed or forced the legislature to pass a series of anti-Semitic bills limiting the professions that Jews might pursue, simply on the pattern of the Nazis during their period of persecution in Germany in the 1930s. One thing about Laval was he was quite interested in having French Jews deported, especially those who had fled to France as their home countries were being occupied by the Germans. He had thousands of them deported, working with the Germans in this case. But then this left a lot of children without their parents who were then defined as orphans. Laval wanted them out, and the Nazis were in no hurry. And he was in a hurry. And he pressured the Germans to send trains, take them out, and most of these trains went to Auschwitz. Most of the children were killed. There were leaders who cooperated and even more than cooperated. In the case of someone like Laval. On the other hand, we do find state intervention on behalf of Jewish communities. Sometimes this came from the government. Sometimes it came from the underground, from the resistance, national resistance forces. Sometimes it was a partnership, as we see in the case of Finland. Very few Jews were deported from Finland, although they're, like other Scandinavian countries, small Jewish population. And then there was a case of Bulgaria. Bulgaria had a fair-sized Jewish community to begin with, probably about 50,000 going into the war. And that population expanded whenever a country seemed to be comparatively safe. We find Jews from elsewhere rushing to move in. That's what they did into Bulgaria. And for a time, generally the Jews in Bulgaria are safe. However, their government falls into the hands of political leaders who are further and further and further toward the right. And in 1940, the prime minister approved a, quote, law for the protection of the nation, largely an imitation of the Nuremberg laws of 1935. So targeting the Jews, placing lots of limits on the Jews, eliminating a lot of their rights. And he received an angry, angry letter from Dimo Kasaza, who was a member of parliament and the editor of the largest newspaper in Bulgaria. So this is directed to the prime minister. This is a lot of what is said in that letter. Quote, in the past, you fought at international conferences for the rights of Bulgarian minorities to live in peace in their countries of residence. And now you attack the Jewish minority in your own country. In so doing, you dishonor the entire Bulgarian people. You are attacking a minority which lives among us and has sacrificed itself for this country. How dare you place them outside of the law? Meanwhile, in March of 1943, this man, Dimitar Khrushchev, who was one of the leaders in the parliament, very nationalistic Bulgarian, heard a report that the government had approved of the deportation of 8,000 Bulgarian Jews. And he visited the office of the Minister of the Interior, who had approved this measure, and yelled at him long and loud until the minister rescinded that agreement to have the 8,000 Jews deported. And this was sort of the end of deportations from Bulgaria. So saving a lot of lives at personal cost. I mean, as we'll see, this was so often the case. Those who interceded in one way or another on behalf of the Jews usually suffered some penalty for it. In Kasazov's case, after he wrote that letter to the prime minister in 1940, he was arrested and imprisoned and was then told he would be released, but only if he promised not to attack the government again. He apparently agreed to this, but he soon started to edit an underground paper continuing to condemn the government for its policy regarding the Jews of Bulgaria. He himself went underground, set up situations where Jews could be shielded, where they could be protected. He was removed from his high position as vice chairman of the parliament. His political career was ruined, but both of these men were later to be counted among the righteous by Yad Vashem. As Germany is expanding, there is the case of Hungary. Hungary, all the nations in Central or East Central Europe, was the one that had the largest Jewish community, and that community was largely safe most of the war. And it kept growing because it was safe. And Jews from all over Central Europe were rushing to get into Hungary. Hungary official ruler was Miklos Horthy, the World War I hero, naval hero. But wielding the most power and the most important with respect to the Jews was this man, Miklos Talai. Talai is a complicated figure. I mean, he was strongly anti-Semitic in terms of his personal outlook. He supported the introduction of a number of anti-Semitic laws targeting the Jews, but he refused to allow mass deportations of Jews out of Hungary so long as he had authority. However, we get to early 1944, the Red Army is advancing on Hungary from the east. Horthy is interested in a separate peace, in making peace with the USSR. The Germans have long wondered just how loyal to them the Hungarian government is. Now becomes convinced that it's not loyal at all. They just want out of the war. That's going to open up a big hole in Germany's defenses. They reduce Horthy's actual power. He continues on as president, but just a titular leader. And Calais is forced out, and his place is taken over by leaders of the neo-Nazi Arrow Cross paramilitary. And they are the ones who are now in power, and they start to allow massive deportations. And the vast majority of the Jews of Hungary were those who were living in Hungary as of the start of 1944. The vast majority of those who would die in the death camps would die in these months, especially the summer and early fall of 1944 at Auschwitz. Now, this was because there was a new government in power. So that is what shifting politics could mean. And usually it was a shift to the worse from the point of view of the Jews. I'm going to shift now and talk about the part played by the Allies, what they knew about what was happening to the Jews in Poland, in the USSR, especially after the Holocaust really got underway in July 1941 after the invasion of the USSR. How much did they know about it? Well, first of all, there were newspaper accounts from day one. But it's usually felt that the real shift happened when an emissary from the Polish underground arrived in London in late 1942. That was this known as Jan Karski. This was his war name, but he kept it. And he had actually been west before, but now he was coming west to talk to representatives of the Allied governments with a lot more information. He wanted as much information on what was happening to the Jews of Poland as possible. He visited the Warsaw Ghetto with the support and at the invitation of the authorities there. He was also sneaked into and sneaked out of one of the death camps. He came very well equipped with information. Karski spoke to several important figures from the British and the American governments. In fact, later went to the United States and spoke to President Roosevelt himself. He told his story, talked about what was happening to the Jews in Poland. Not everyone believed him, or at least many thought he was exaggerating. And one of these was maybe a surprising person. This was Felix Frankfurter, who was a Jewish justice of the United States Supreme Court. And Frankfurter, in fact, was an avid Zionist. And he was very concerned for the Jews of Poland and generally of Europe. And yet, when Karski had finished, Frankfurter said, "Young man, I don't believe you." And a member of the Polish resistance got up and he said, "No, this man is absolutely reliable." And Frankfurter said, I didn't say that he was lying. I said that I could not believe him. There is a difference. But in a sense, it was beneficial to the Allies from the propaganda perspective to say that these atrocity stories about the Nazis and their lies were true. And in December 1942, the United Nations, now this was the wartime name for the Allies, so mainly Britain and the United States, they put out this declaration. German authorities are now carrying into effect Hitler's oft-repeated intention to exterminate the Jewish people in Europe. As you can see, this is December 1942, and the statement comes out and goes into the British press, into the American press. It goes out on the BBC. Actually, for several months before this, the BBC had been reporting on mass killings in the Soviet Union by the Einsatzgruppen, etc., mass murder. But now it's magnified. Now it's something bigger because the United Nations is coming out with a strong statement. Another topic, and talk a little bit about Jewish organizations and the relief effort, both in the late 1930s and before and after the White Paper of 1939, which made things more difficult, and the early stages of World War II and of the Holocaust. What are they trying to do? Well, of course, they're trying to assist the Jews of Europe. Very important to this mix is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and also the Jewish Agency for Palestine. The Jewish Agency for Palestine was founded in 1923. The British government, the mandatory power there, of course, accepted the agency as essentially the government for the Jews living in the Palestinian Mandate. So they had great sway, and they tried to get Jews into the Mandate. They tried that during the 1930s and on really through the war. And they are both pressuring the government to do something. And in 1940, 1941, FDR is able to lift the curtain enough. I mean, there are these limits on immigration, but he's able to raise the curtain enough to allow about 30,000 Jews to immigrate to the United States. But the concerns continue to be voiced, and there are those who want more. And finally, in early 1942, the United States government and several other governments agreed to have a conference in Bermuda to discuss the refugee problem. But this leads to a cruel mockery. Here is the mockery as described by the New York Times after the conference closes and issues its report, in which case, well, it was like that conference that I've spoken of earlier, the one at Aviella, where the representatives of a number of governments get together and do nothing at all substantial for Jewish refugees. And this basically was just like a conference. They didn't allow for any changes. They didn't allow for any improvements in the immigration system. Note, by the way, the banner headline here. With 5 million Jews in the Nazi death trap, Bermuda was a cruel mockery. 5 million Jews. That is sort of what the problem was at this point in 1943. Yes, they are talking about these people being in tremendous danger. The complaints go on. Many Jewish organizations involved, but also many non-Jews who were important. The Archbishop of Canterbury, among others, asking for the Allies to do something. And finally, in January 1944, FDR establishes the War Refugee Board. It's given only a small budget to work with and a limited staff, but it does manage to do some important things. Notably, one man is often recognized for the great work he did. This is Ira Hirschman. He was stationed in Istanbul, and he was able to get perhaps 5,000 Jews out of Europe to Palestine or to the United States. He, I should mention, though, was an extremely wealthy man. He was involved with several huge apartment stores in New York City. So if his official budget wasn't very high, well, he could afford to pay for some things out of pocket. The State Department and the Jews. It seemed that even the president was not getting the cooperation regarding Jews who should have been allowed to get in to the States to get in. And a lot of fingers pointed at the State Department as the problem here. The State Department had all kinds of power over red tape and delaying the ability of even a Jew or other refugee who had not only the need to get into the United States, but also seemed to be well qualified. And one who exposed this was Henry Morgenthau. He was the highest ranking Jewish member of the president's inner circle, if you will. He was the Secretary of the Treasury in the New Deal administration. And in late 1943, a couple of his assistants, who, by the way, were not Jewish, came to him and said that they believed that the State Department was really obstructing the passage of Jews who wanted to come to the United States and were well qualified in every way and greatly in need. And they were willing to put together a report for him that would give details. And he authorized them to do it. And they gave him that report. And he then had it sent on to the president. And he himself wrote a preface for it. And this is part of what he wrote. Certain officials in our State Department have been guilty not only of gross procrastination, but even of willful attempts to prevent action from being taken to rescue Jews from Hitler. And as you can see, the title of this document, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of Jews. Not only was the State Department, not only did it include in high places men who were avowedly and often loudly anti-Semitic, but so were the opposite numbers in other governments. One of these was the British Foreign Office, essentially the British equivalent of the State Department. And in December 1943, in the wake of a plan to offer financial inducements to help get some Jews out of Europe, the Foreign Office wrote this. The Foreign Office is concerned with the difficulty of disposing of any considerable number of Jews should they be released from enemy territory. For this reason, they are reluctant even now to approve the preliminary financial arrangements. The Holocaust and the war effort. And a big question is often raised, well, especially as the Allies were moving in from all directions for Germany after D-Day and for the balance of the war. And they were in a position to do something to benefit those Jews who were still alive, who were only a small minority of the Jews who'd been in Europe at the start of the war. Very little was done militarily aside from doing what perhaps FDR said at the start of the war, that the assault on the Jews will end when we have defeated the Nazis. There were always those who said no. Okay, I'll just give you the extreme case. In the summer of 1944, the War Refugee Board and the World Jewish Congress sent a letter to John McCloy, who was the Assistant Secretary of War, asking him to confer with other leaders of the military and see why couldn't they also bomb Auschwitz, bomb the crematoria, bomb the gas chamber, bomb the rail lines that go there, so that no more Jews can be brought in. He hesitated for a few days, and then he said no. He said, first of all, we have our military objectives, and concentrating on Auschwitz would hinder our success in achieving these goals. But he also said, there has been considerable opinion to the effect that such an effort, meaning the bombing, even if practicable, might provoke even more vindictive action by the Germans, which would still maybe kind of dull. And McCloy seems to recognize this. And later, after the war was over, he said basically, look, FDR did not want this other plan for the bombing of Auschwitz to go into force. He wanted focus on the war effort. That was it. So I just thought of excuses to justify not acceding to this request for bombing. So the Allies could certainly have done more. I think that any of the overwhelming majority of historians who have researched the Allies and the Holocaust would say this, would agree to this point. The question is, was it just that they wanted to focus so much on winning the war, not really concentrating as much on the fate of the Jews in Europe, or was it more a problem of prejudice, really not caring what was happening to the Jews in Europe? Historians have written endlessly on this, and almost all of them say, well, a lot of it was antisemitism. Okay, that is going to conclude Lecture 5, and now we're going to move into Lecture 6, titled Inside the Holocaust. Number 2, we've just finished number 1, perpetrators, rescuers, bystanders, and Jews. Now I'm going to be talking ultimately about individuals or small groups and how they reacted to the circumstance of the Holocaust. The incentives to harm, of course, especially the Jews, loathing in theory the Jews, and here talking particularly in terms of Germans. This cartoon says a great deal about how the Jew is seen. Both of these, by the way, stock characters, stock caricatures, if you will. The very physical, very powerful, and very white German Aryan, and a seemingly terrified Jew, very much figure in caricature. Yes, he's got his big nose, he has his weak chin, he has his dark hair and clothing, he has his 5 o'clock shadow. Jews usually shown this way, complete with the stubble, which is always dark, because it helps convey an image of darkness for the Jew. The Jew is never to look too white. Whiteness was for Aryans. The Jew was supposed to be dark, a different race. But anyway, physically unimposing and as an individual, easy to intimidate. But then there was the other caricature or stereotype, the Jew in power, the Jew secretly in control of countries all over, including the various allies. And all this shows again a Jew of caricature, a Jew of stereotype on this poster. And in front of him, all the flags of the three leading allies, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. So the Jew in control, so a great danger. Beyond this, incentives to harm the Jew, the strength of the German association, extreme nationalism, drive to conform to the dictates of society and to the dictates of the government, and to be obedient to the directives of the government, especially strong among young people who have been through the schooling system in Nazi Germany. It would be very interesting if we could cite public opinion polls from Nazi Germany and polls that talked about attitudes toward the Jews. We talk about different categories of perpetrators, those who, one way or another, had a hand in the final solution. Start with a group that is sometimes called the desk murderers, those who don't themselves kill Jews, but they are very much involved in the overall process. And the one usually thought of immediately when we think of a desk murderer is Eichmann, here shown in uniform in war. Here is shown riffling through papers while he was a defendant in Jerusalem in 1962. Eichmann was his technical position was the head of the Jewish office in the Gestapo. And they kept track of Jews from all over Europe as best they could. They kept an infinite number of records. It is Eichmann, by the way, whose testimony will be revealed at the first Nuremberg trial of 1945-46, as having said that 6 million Jews had died in the Holocaust. I should add that when he was in Jerusalem, he said, well, it may not have been 6 million, may have been close to 5 million. But anyway, that range. Eichmann claimed at his trial in Jerusalem, I never killed a Jew and I never gave an order to kill. However, he admitted to, quote, aiding and abetting one of the greatest crimes in the history of humanity. He is often thought of as the model desk murderer. Beyond him, we can think of a number of intellectuals and professionals who sat behind various desks and personally shoot anyone. And one thing that is noteworthy about them is that they are typically very well educated. This photo is of the Wannsee house, Wannsee, a wealthy suburb of Berlin. It was at this mansion in January 1942 that a well-known conference was held, officiated at by Heydrich, and Eichmann was also there from the SS, and it brought together the heads of a number of government bureaus who were discussing progress of the final solution up to that point and where it should go now. Of the bureau chiefs who were there, almost all of them had PhDs. To some extent, the Nazi government and the armed forces took advantage of quality of education, preferred having men who were well educated. Here is the propaganda. This is Joseph Goebbels. He was another of the PhDs. Oh, among the earliest converts to Nazism back in the 1920s were members of the medical profession. First of all, they were attracted to racialism as a theory to build on. Second, they didn't like having all the Jewish doctors who were competing with them. And here we can go back into classic anti-Semitism dating back centuries. There had been an association of Jews with disease. That's what gave legends about Jews causing the Black Death, which I talked about earlier. That Jews were thought of as being responsible for killing lots of people through epidemics, etc. Hitler was one of many to identify Jews with germs, with cancerous tumors, etc., etc., etc. During the 1870s, a biblical scholar named Paul de Lagarde, a German. This was just as Pasteur was popularizing germ theory in medicine. And Lagarde commented, with trichini and bacilli, one does not negotiate. They are exterminated as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. And said that since Jews represented such a danger to the health of peoples, that this was yet another reason to persecute them. There are lots and lots of stories about the World War II period, and especially about Nazi doctors in the camps. Certainly the most notorious being Joseph Mengele here, Dr. Death, although there were many Dr. Deaths at Auschwitz, noteworthy for his racialism-inspired experiments trying to inject blue dye into the eyes of Jews and other dark-eyed people to see if they would turn blue. And he did, at least not permanently. Also famous for his experiments on identical twins. Well, those experiments had killed so many children. Also like to talk a bit about the case of a physician named August Hirt, who was important academically. He was the director of anatomy at Reich University, and he complained to the SS that he didn't have enough Jewish skulls for his collection. Skulls were supposed to disclose all kinds of characteristics of the group. He wanted more skulls. And Himmler, who was very, very strongly racist, Himmler, of course, being the head of the SS, liked experiments and explorations that had something to do with racial theory. Anyway, he heard about Hirt's appeal for skulls, and he had Jewish inmates at Auschwitz examined to see who seemed to have the best skulls. And eventually 115 men and women were picked out. They were sent to a more distant concentration camp that had a gas chamber. They were gassed there. And also Hirt had his skulls. That was Nazi medicine. Okay, we're still into the perpetrators, and now especially those who gave the orders to kill. This man is Rudolf Höss, who was commandant of Auschwitz for most of the war. This is a photo of him as he is going through trial in late 1947. He would then be hanged at Auschwitz. Höss wrote a memoir. Spent much of his last year writing a memoir, discussing particularly his time as commandant at Auschwitz. He wrote it, he claimed, to show that he had a heart and was not evil. This is what he wrote about his day-to-day activities. I had to watch coldly while the mothers with laughing or crying children went into the gas chambers. I had to look through the peephole of the gas chambers and watch the process of death itself because the doctors wanted me to see it. This Franz Stangl. He was the commandant at Treblinka death camp for about a year. At the end of the war, he was able to escape South America. He was eventually captured, was brought back to Germany, was tried as having responsibility for 90,000 deaths, the preponderant number of them Jews. He was given a life sentence, not a death sentence, a life sentence. He was interviewed over the period of several months. He was interviewed by a journalist named Gitta Sereni. She would eventually write a memoir biography based on these interviews called Into That Darkness, which is well worth reading. And the interesting thing is that she doesn't just accept whatever Stangl wants to say to her. She keeps challenging him and challenging him and challenging him. And he does sometimes adapt to his testimony. Here's something he says. The worst place at Treblinka was the undressing barracks. I avoided it from my innermost being. I couldn't confront them. I couldn't lie to them. I avoided at any price talking to those who were about to die. Okay, so both limiting the amount of guilt, that is to say, Stangl and Höss, that should be associated with them. I'd have to say that there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they were making themselves look a lot less guilty than they were. During the war, Eichmann was ordered to check out things at Auschwitz. He spoke to several of the officers there, including Bullhurst. And this is what he observed later in one of his interrogations before he went on trial in Jerusalem. This is what we have for his visit to Auschwitz. Those fellows were very cruel, describing those things, killings, of course, as gruesomely as possible to a man accustomed to desk work himself. Naturally, they laughed their heads off when my nerves broke down. Hearst told me Himmler had been there and taken a good look at everything. He told me Himmler had got all weak in the knees. He meant that in a disparaging sense, because Hearst himself was thoroughly hard. Okay, let's move down a number of pegs to rank and file killers. Okay, and going to discuss a bit from a very famous book called Ordinary Men. If you want one book that isn't terribly long on perpetrators of the Holocaust, this is the book. Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, published in 1993. What had happened was there was a sort of a lower caste units called the Order Police. The Order Police were typically, this was a branch of the SS. The Order Police were units that were sent into occupied areas just to keep the peace. That's why they Order Police. And this is the story of Reserve Police Battalion, that's an Order Police Battalion, 101. What happened was this unit was in occupied Poland for about a year, 1942-43. And they were responsible for the deaths of at least 90,000 Jews, either that they killed them or that they arranged for their deportation to death camps. In the early 1960s, several surviving officers of this Order Battalion were charged with war crimes. That was a background as preparation for their trial. The men who had served under them were deposed, and in their depositions, they talked about what they remembered about their time in Poland. And one thing that many of them spoke about in their depositions was the first time they were ordered to kill. And these depositions were read and interpreted by Christopher Brown. They're basic to his book, and he quotes them a lot. This unit, the men in the unit, were mainly from Hamburg. They were older than the elite SS men. They were usually in their upper 30s or their 40s. Many of them were in business back in Hamburg. That's what their civilian lives were. So what did this deposition say? They agree on several points that the commanding officer, this was shortly after they had arrived in Poland and especially in a particular town. One day, the commander of the police unit, the major, read orders out to them that had come from superiors. And he started weeping as he read these orders. And he said that they had been ordered to basically wipe out Jews in that town. So the plan was that the men would be sent out on various jobs, leaving their wives and children alone, along with elderly Jews. And those people would all be killed by the members of the Order Battalion. That was what the order was. And that he had said that if there were those who absolutely did not want to participate in this killing, they should walk toward him, basically a line in the sand, walk toward him, and he offered them protection. So nothing would happen to them. And they would get out of that all that duty, he would find something else for them to do. It didn't involve killing. Well, however, out of the hundreds of men in the battalion, only about 12 plus one officer walked toward him, get out of that duty, participate in the killing. The others may not have been thrilled to do it, but they did it. And many of them recalled also in their depositions that after that day came many similar orders, and it became easier and easier and easier for them to kill Jews. They didn't worry about the duty. This is Otto Ohlendorf. He, by the way, had 2 PhDs, and he was the head of one of the Einsatzgruppen. He was eventually tried for, there was something called the Einsatzgruppen trial, one of the Nuremberg trials. And he and other commandants of the Einsatzgruppen units were executed. But he said in his testimony, he didn't deny that they had been responsible for killing 90,000 or so people, mainly Jews. But he also said, I had sufficient occasion to see how many men of my group did not agree to this order in their inner opinion. Thus I forbade the participation in these executions on the part of some of these men, and I sent some back to Germany. And his adjutant backed up his testimony by saying, Ohlendorf announced to the group that particular individuals were unfit for the performance of such tasks and therefore were to be released. So these men may have lost their reputation, but they killed people. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that there were criminal cases where soldiers and even SS men refused to kill Jews, and they were seldom heavily penalized. At worst, they might be sent to a concentration camp, but they were very seldom killed, though seldom doesn't mean never. And we'll talk about a case along that line in a minute. Duty and sadism. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked about how well we can trace the ordering of the Holocaust. That is, that we can demonstrate documents from the time that speak about and speak to the ordering. There are plenty of documents that actuate orders to kill. I read a couple of them from July 1940, on the eve of the start of the actual mass killing in the part of the USSR that was being invaded. And I quoted that order from Heydrich that specifically says that it was the Fuhrer's order, Hitler's order, that was actuating this killing. So now I'd like to read to you a related document that is hugely important. It's a quotation from a speech that Heinrich Himmler, of course, the head of the SS, gave in October 1943 at a Polish city named Posen. And the subject of his speech, which went on for several hours, was really what makes a perfect SS man. But he went off on a lot of tangents as he was addressing this premise that were. He said, among other things, it's one of those things that is that it is one of those things that is easy to talk about. The Jewish race is being exterminated, such says one party member, Nazi party. That's quite clear. But then he turns to the SS officers, their high-ranking officers who are his audience. And he says, most of you must know what it means when 100 corpses are lying side by side, or 500 or 1,000. And then he gets back to this idea of what is the perfect SS man like? To have stuck it out and at the same time, apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent fellows. That is what has made us hard. That they have become really used to this, they accept it. That's all this killing is going on. The speech at Posen is often quoted for various reasons. It was actually, first of all, recorded. In other words, we have the sound of Himmler's voice recorded on a record, and that record is available on the internet, along with full translation of Himmler's words. Well, I don't know that the whole 3 or 4 hours of the lecture is, but certainly this portion is very famous. Himmler, even though he said that, people shouldn't really talk about the extermination of the Jews, about this program. And he says also in the same speech, this is a page of glory in our history, which has never been written and is never to be written. Yet he often spoke about it. And all the people that he spoke to about it, well, they all agreed that it was quite, to them, because he trusted them, he was quite open. Persecution and even killing for the fun of it. You always see a street scene in the Warsaw Ghetto, and an SS man is kicked a Jew on their were laughing. And then we have this killing in Kovno. Men from Einsatzgruppe A prepare to shoot you. And once again, it looks as though this man who is about to shoot a Jew on the back of the head is gray. The killers may have been actuated by a sense of duty. They were following orders, but some of them give evidence of liking what they were doing. We had a speaker in Holocaust Memorial Week a couple of years ago who said that they drank an awful lot of alcohol and this may have helped them kill people, but they don't seem to have needed all that much coping. All right, going to change the subject here. Altruists, the rescuers. First, I'll talk about the mercenaries, those who took advantage of desperate Jews, what they had to gain from it. Maybe money, or that they might find a spare room for a Jew to live in, but boy, he was going to pay for it well. Or souls. Lots of reports about Jews and particularly young children being accepted and given sanctuary in monasteries and convents, but then also being encouraged to accept baptism. So there were those who took advantage. But there were also the altruistic protectors who just did it because they felt it was the right thing to do. To give a little framework to this discussion, the word altruism is usually credited to Sigmund Freud, a famous treatise of his entitled Civilization of Discontents, which was published in 1930. And he says that virtually all people are born as egoists. That is to say, they think first and foremost of themselves, their own interests, even if they're just babies, hear themselves and what they want. However, some people, as they mature, become altruists, thinking first of all of the benefit to others. Freud didn't think, by the way, that it was necessarily a good thing to be an altruist. It could endanger oneself. depending on what he or she was doing for the benefit of others. But at any rate, so we have this word altruism. And I thought I would talk a bit about altruists and start with testimony from a man named Peter Medema and a sermon that he gave. He was a Dutch minister, and he gave his congregation a sermon in early 1942. This was at the time that roundups and deportations of Dutch Jews were starting, early 1942. And this is some of what he said. Imagine that someone knocks on your door, and that someone is a mother with a small child, both sporting the yellow badge of shame. They are seeking shelter from the sharp teeth of the Nazi wolf. Look deeply into the panic-inflamed eyes of the mother, and then imagine the wolf carrying off the child. If you opt against opening your home and heart to an innocent fugitive, you have no place in the community of the just. Earlier, I talked about those who refused orders to kill Jews, and the fact that they might be humiliated by being sent away, as Ollendorf says he did. Some might be sent to prison or to concentration camps. Two of the men who had shielded the Frank family in Amsterdam were sent to concentration camps. Here's the case. This was a sergeant named Anton. He was not an SS man. He was in the Wehrmacht, the regular German army. And he is credited with having rescued 250 Lithuanian Jews in the early spring of 1942 as the army, as the Einsatzgruppe moving into Lithuania. And he was sentenced to death by firing squad. And the night before he was executed, he wrote to his wife and said, "You know how it is with my soft heart. I could not think and had to help." In fact, this is a theme of people suffering for their altruism. And there are countless examples. Among those who were most successful in rescuing Jews as a group were the diplomats, because they were the ones who could make up letters of transit, visas, etc., to get Jews who were endangered out of the country or out of a certain zone, get them to safety. And there are many, many stories about many individuals who did this. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First, the subject of several book-length biographies is this man. The only Japanese is recognized as one of the righteous by Yad Vashem. He was a longtime diplomat. He was a Christian, by the way, Sugihara. Early in the war, he became consul general in Lithuania. And he started to see, the Soviets invaded. Later, the Germans would invade. But anyway, at this time, it was the Soviets. And there were long lines of people standing outside the consulate where he worked, looking for some sort of safety. And most of them were Jews. And Sugihara wrote back to the Japanese Foreign Office, asked if it would be okay if he made up visas for them. And he was told no, but he did it anyway. He spent 2 months, he and his wife, taking up these visas for perhaps 10,000 Jews, and most of them were able to get out thanks to him. He was then captured by the Soviets, sent the rest of the war in one of their prisons. Well, they got back to Japan to find out that he had been dismissed for insubordination while he was away. And his wife thought it was specifically because he had disobeyed that order against writing up these exit visas. Anyway, he commented, they needed help. I'm glad I found the strength to make the decision to give it to them. And then there is this hearing, the one on the left of the photo, by Chaim Kruger. And on the right is Aristides de Sousa Mendes from Portugal. Okay, he's Portuguese. He was, at the time of the German invasion of France in 1940, the consul general in Bordeaux, which was in Vichy, France. He became friendly with Kruger and told him he would be quite willing to make up a visa so Kruger could get out. But Kruger said he didn't want to go unless the other Jews there were able to go too. And many of them were desperate to get out of Bordeaux, to get out of Vichy, France, to get into Spain. Spain was neutral. They would be a lot safer there. He asked the government if he could please make up these. He was told no. He did it anyway. He, working with his wife, his children, staff members, ran out of forms for visas. Although they started to pull wallpaper off the wall and cut it up and use it to make visas. And ultimately, this in June of 1940, managed to prepare, he and his helpers, as many as 70,000 travel visas and handed them out. I became worried that the Portuguese government back in Lisbon was going to find out what he'd done and send out messages to the various, of course, into the various portals in Spain, and that these would be regarded as annulled and Jews couldn't get out. So he drove out and caught up with this big column of Jews who were trying to get out and told them to follow him. And he took them to a very out-of-the-way border crossing that was operated by the Portuguese. And they had heard that these documents should be ignored. So the Jews were able to get out. Anyway, he got back to Lisbon himself and found out that he had been fired. And beyond that, he was humiliated. His income was confiscated. And he died poor. I told you, the most successful of all altruists were the diplomats. And here's the most successful of them. Joel Wallenberg. He is, for many reasons, a man of mystery. He was born into a very wealthy Swedish family. He came to the United States to study at the University of Michigan for a couple of years. We know that he had some Jewish friends while he was there. But anyway, he went back to Sweden, which was neutral during the war. He could have just sat out the war and lived very well, but he chose not to do that. Instead, he took up what he probably knew was a dangerous mission as a minister without portfolio at the Swedish embassy in Budapest. But his secret mission, what he was there for, was to help save the Jews of Budapest, Hungary, that area. And that is what he worked to do. He used lots of means. He had lots and lots of documents printed up that various people were under the protection of the Swedish government. These people were Jews, and stories about him going down to rail stations where trains were loading up with Jews to take them to Auschwitz, and he would be handing these letters of protection through the window. He also set up facilities in Budapest and elsewhere, places of refuge for Jews. He also used threats. He told German officers that they knew that the war was going to run. They knew that Germany was going to lose. And after the war, there would be trials for war crimes if they would not harm the Jews, or better still, if they would protect the Jews. He would testify in their defense. If they harmed the Jews or allowed them to be harmed, he would testify against those trials. So he, considerable array of strategies. He has been honored, perhaps more than any other altruist. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum stands on Wallenberg Way in D.C. He, of course, is acknowledged one of the righteous at Yad Vashem, many other honors, but these are all posthumous. When the Red Army moved into Budapest in early 1945, he was taken prisoner. He was taken into the Soviet Union, taken to a prison camp. And for a very long time, nobody, at least no government, asked what had happened to him. Not any Allied government, not the Hungarian government, not the Swedish government. It was only in the 1970s that some of them started asking what did happen to Wallenberg. And they were eventually told that he died of a heart attack in 1947. But later, that story was revised. No, he had died in 1947, but he'd been executed. Why? We don't know. But that is what happened to Wallenberg. These are some of the leading figures in Judicota, which, as you can see, code name for the Council for Aid to Jews, composed mainly of Polish Catholics. There were a few Jews, like this woman, second from the left on the second line. But the two best known of those who are here are the man who's third from the right, or second from the left on the top line. That is mainly known as a diplomat, Władysław Bartoszewski. And person over, second from the right, top line, that is Irena Sendler, possibly the legend. She and Bartoszewski, along with a lot of other members of Judicota, are recognized as being among the righteous. In fact, Sendler and Bartoszewski were admitted pretty much as soon as they started giving out these events of service, these recognitions of righteousness. But anyway, what did they do? Well, okay, what Irena Sendler is famous for is that now she was a social worker. She visited the Warsaw Ghetto a number of times in early 1943, trying to and going to meet with Jewish parents, encouraging them to give their young children, and that she would then smuggle them out of the ghetto, and they would be taken care of by sympathetic Polish farmers mainly, which was, of course, a hard bill to sell. She wasn't known by these people, and here she was saying, please give me your children. But at any rate, that's what she's especially remembered for. She is credited with having saved about 4,000 children, and she herself certainly many hundreds of them. And there were underground rescue groups to be found everywhere, even in Berlin itself. However, the Jagoda was larger than most. It was more successful than most. Okay, another case of a group involvement among centers of altruism. Maybe the classic is a city in the foothills to the French Alps, southeastern France, Luxembourg. This is a photo of Jewish children playing in the snow. This is a photo of three men who were instrumental in protecting Jewish families, including these children here. The man on the left, in glasses, that is Andre Trocme. He was the minister of the church there. He was a very fervent pacifist, but apparently he encouraged his congregation to use the weapons of the spirit to assist Jews who were in danger. And that became the title of a very famous, very highly recommended film on Luxembourg, Weapons of the Spirit, directed by Pierre Sauvage, who himself was born at Luxembourg. Originally, this idea to protect Jews belonged to Andre Kopperman, and also noteworthy is the one on the right here, Edward Pease, who was the assistant pastor to Trocme, and he was still alive when Weapons of the Spirit was filmed in the early 1980s, and he speaks quite a bit about how things worked at Luxembourg, and certainly some thousands of Jews were protected there, were sent safely on their way into Italy from there. So the most famous of the was offering sanctuary to Jews, offering protection. There were some. And then there was the nation that was so helpful. Denmark. Denmark, obviously, is just north of Germany, they share a border. They were forced into an alliance with the Germans, but they were not occupied until 1943. They did, however, develop in the meantime a significant underground. The Germans looked on them as not really liking the Nazis, and they were quite right in this. There was a small but fairly successful Jewish community, maybe about 8 or 9,000 in Denmark. In any case, late in the summer of 1943, the Germans decided to all occupy Denmark. And they also decided to round up and deport Danish Jews on October 1st. But the Danish government was warned by a diplomat and naval attaché named Georg Buchbitz that there was going to be this mass deportation on October 1st. The Danes should make arrangements to rescue the Jews. And he then went to Sweden, spoke to the Swedish Prime Minister, and told him that Danes would be evacuating the Jews and they would like to evacuate them to Sweden, and would the Swedes please receive them well, not harm them. And he got those assurances from the Prime Minister, so he did two really important things. And this all led to the famous evacuation of the Danish Jews on September 30th, the day before the deportation was supposed to start. Jews get evacuated from Poland. All but a few hundred were successfully evacuated. Even those who were left behind, well, some of them were deported by the Germans, but they were sent to comparatively safe concentration camps. There is not a single known case of one of them being killed. And this, historians believe, is because they knew that the Danish government did not want them to harm these Jews. More general European society, and certainly places like Germany, altruism was tied to nonconformity. The conformists, the ones who just sort of went along with community thinking, they were big in their associations, but they were not going to protect Jews. They were probably quite anti-Semitic. These were the ones who saw things with a different perspective and were willing to act on that. Okay, and now I've been alluding to this a lot. This is a list of righteous of the nations kept by Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem, by the way, was envisioned, I guess I should say, while the war and while the Holocaust were still going on. And of course, at that time, Israel didn't even exist as a state. But at any rate, in the early 1950s, the Knesset established, founded Yad Vashem, the name taken from a line in the book of Isaiah. In 1953, before the museum was built, the Knesset ordered that Yad Vashem should find some suitable way to recognize the deeds of the rescuers. And finally, in 1963, so 10 years later, honored the first group of righteous. And I thought that I would show you a list by nationality. So you can see at that time, the number of righteous as recognized by Yad Vashem was almost 28,000. I'm sure it's a couple thousand higher now. And number one, by a significant margin, is Poland. It's interesting. Often when one thinks of Poland, one thinks of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of this, but also Poles, for various reasons, who worked to protect Jews, and the need was greatest there. All of the death camps, all 6 of them, were in either Poland at the time or Poland areas that had been seized by Germany and annexed into it, but were still culturally Polish. So Poland is number 1, but very interesting. Number 2, that's Netherlands, with obviously a far smaller population than Poland is. Comparatively low antisemitism by European standards, very, very, very. And again, I would look back to the influence of the Dutch Reformed Church in this. I talked about those Calvinist congregations as being more tolerant of Jews. Anyway, we go down the list. And basically, the list shows places where there was lots of need to aid Jews. Okay, so there is your list. And if you're saying, well, where's the U.S.? The total number of Americans recognized as being among the righteous by Yad Vashem is 5, which doesn't mean that Americans didn't care, but for most of them, the Holocaust was kind of far away. They weren't in the same position to intercede as were some of these other people. Elie Wiesel, this is 1979, and an article that I read by him, he reminisces here about the righteous. None of the just crossed my path during the war. None of our Christian neighbors in my small village of Siget in Romania risked his life to take in, to hide, to rescue a Jewish friend or a Jewish child. I can never forget our last walk to the station, the cattle cars. The town seemed surreally peaceful, not sad at all to see us leaving, setting out toward the unknown. Okay, that can lead us into the next section of this lecture, the bystanders. What were they like? They were actually a far larger category than the Jews or the perpetrators. Certainly a far larger category than the altruists by many times. So why didn't they do anything? They didn't harm the Jews, they didn't kill them, but they didn't do anything to help them either. Why? We really don't know. We can see lots of photographic evidence of bystanders, like these people who are just watching as Jews from their town, from ghetto in their town, are being cleared out. You don't know what they're thinking. Here you see Poles in Warsaw, all looking up in the direction of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is going up in flames. This would be in the spring of 1943. And we wonder, well, what were they thinking? Maybe they're concerned. They're really sorry that this is happening, but they don't know what they can do about it. And in turn, maybe they're afraid of consequences if they try to do anything about it. Not only may they be hurt or killed, but so many members of their family. There could well be that reasoning. But there's also basis for thinking that really they were indifferent or hostile themselves. And although they didn't intervene to harm Jews, they were not going to intervene to help them either. One of the great massacres in the Holocaust period, actually a series of massacres that took place in Baba Yar, Kiev, in 1941. One of the interesting things about it is that we have extant a series of reports by the commander of the Einsatzgruppen unit that perpetrated these massacres. And he attached numbers to them. He said that in a 2-day span, they had killed 33,711 Jews. So that number, maybe it was a few too many, maybe it was a few too few. I'm not saying that his number is exactly correct, but you see, there were lots of reports like this coming into Eichmann. This why he had so much data come up in terms of the number of Jews killed. The same officer, the same SS officer, commented in one of his letters while the massacres at Beit Am were going on. The population of Kiev scarcely knew that the Jews were liquidated, but the latest experience suggests that they would not object. After the war ended, after the Holocaust, of course, ended, the government in Poland set up a group of historians to investigate what happened during the Holocaust, what happened to Jews in Hungary. And one of them wrote, if during the persecutions a Jew was to have knocked randomly on any door, the odds were that he would have been handed over to the authorities. He had just about no chance at all of being offered refuge, even temporarily. That was so often what the Jews were up against. Okay, that is what I'm going to say about the bystanders. I'm going to give the rest of this lecture over to the Jews. Again, I'm going to divide them into different categories. First of all, Jews who wondered what was in fact going to happen to them at the hands of the Germans or their allies. There is so often a theme like this. If you have read the classic of classics among survivor accounts, Night by Elie Wiesel, you might recall that it starts, the first character we're introduced to is a beetle, Wocha the beetle, of his congregation. And he really likes him. That is, Wiesel likes this man a lot because he instructs him in Torah and is even introducing him to Talmud, although he's just in his early teens. But then one day, this man is deported and manages to escape. He gets back to this town where he settles, and he tells, taking us away to be killed. And according to Michelle, the people of the town just saying, no, he's just making up. He wants sympathy, he wants money. This is such a common story in Holocaust memoirs. Jews not believing what is going to happen to them if they get on that train. You say, what lies ahead for them? That they may be persecuted, well, okay, but killed? No, we're not going to do that. I'm going to read to you a letter. This, shortly after the invasion of the Soviet Union, as you can see, a report of a German officer on the Eastern Front. Quote, the Jews are remarkably ill-informed about our attitude toward them. Even if they do not think that under German administration they will have equal rights with the Russians, they believe, nonetheless, that we shall leave them in peace if they mind their business and work diligently. And of course, this was not the case. And now, Anne Frank's diary, and this is a diary entry from October 1942. She has heard from the BBC that Jews are being killed in camps They're being gassed. What actuates this is she hears that things are pretty bad. The Westerbork transit camp, where Jews who were being deported from the Netherlands are taken, where she and her family would later be taken. And this is what she writes in her diary. If it is as bad as this in Holland, meaning Westerbork, whatever will it be like in the distant and barbarous regions they are sent to? We assume that most of them are murdered. The English radio speaks of their being gassed. Okay, this is October 9th, 1942. The news was getting out this early. This is even before that statement by the United Nations that I read out earlier. It was getting out in newspapers, it was getting out over the radio, what was happening to Jews. Certainly, we find, especially early in the war, there are many Jews who wonder what happens, how bad can it be? Okay, let's talk about the Jews, those who fled. Some years ago, very important American historian of literature, I guess you can say, named Lawrence Langer, who has spoken a couple of times at Holocaust Memorial Week here, wrote an essay about what he called choiceless choices, where whatever decisions Jews made when there was this threat facing them, they made the wrong decision. Not that there was a right decision. They were all wrong decisions. There were the women who were told by camp guards that those who were accompanied by their children, one of them was going to be killed. Which one should they kill? That sort of thing. These choices, but they weren't enforced. To flee was often a very, very difficult choice. We might think it would be easy, but it isn't. And then I thought I would give a few examples of that. First, Mouse came out in fall of 1986. And then a few years later, Mouse 2 came out. They're both based mainly on the story of the artist Art Spiegelman, his father Vladek, who with his wife had been at Auschwitz after a time of hiding out. Early on in Mouse, we're told where Vladek tells about Spiegelman's older brother. And the Germans are taking over much of Poland, and they're terrified. As parents, they're desperately afraid that their child is going to be killed by the Nazis. And a cousin of one says, look, you give me the child. I live in a small town. They're not going to come there. You're in much greater danger here in the city. And these Spiegelmans give in, give the child over, but the Germans do come. And a woman poisons the children because she knows what's going to happen to them if they're able to deport them. She poisons herself too. That was one of these choiceless choices. She thought she was giving good advice in offering to take the child, but wound up being bad advice. So these were not good choices. There are lots of these that we read about. Another was a book called Jacob's World, written by a man who was a child, was Jakob Slabmacher, the Polish Jew. Later on, he made it to the States. He became a psychiatrist. His name was Jack Terry. That was the name he took. He and his family live in a medium-sized Polish city. Lots of Jews. And of course, the Germans come, 1939. And the parents decide to try to protect their two children, Jacob and his sister, by sending them to live with a farmer that they know well. And they live on his farm. They sleep in the barn. They didn't want to go to begin with. And they become increasingly homesick. And finally, one night, they take off and run home. And Jacob's sister, as well as all his parents, would die in the Holocaust. He was the only one in the family who would survive. And, that's another choiceless choice. It seemed wise. Maybe the odds good, but it didn't work out because the kids didn't want to be away from mom and papa. And one last case I'll give, this will be the last thing I will deal with today, comes from the memoir by a Lithuanian Jew who settled in Vancouver, British Columbia after the war. His name was Leon Kahn. And his father, this was after the Germans moved into Lithuania, wanted to go into the forest and join a partisan group, a resistance group. And then he said we'd be protected there. John's mother didn't want to go because they were living with her elderly mother. And she said, look, I have to stay and help my mother. Would be no one else to do it. She can't help herself. She's too old. And Kahn said that they spent 2 days trying to persuade her to change her mind. But she wouldn't. And finally, the rest of the family did go off into the forest. Kahn was in the war fighting for the resistance. And his mother and grandmother would wind up dying at Auschwitz. The choices people make, we shouldn't think that they were easy choices, but they saved lots and lots of lives.